In our previous lesson, we covered the terminology or language when it comes to talking about writing plugins in Sublime Text. When it comes to actually writing a plugin, one of the more common things you're going to want to do is add some sort of new action. So, in this week's lesson, let's cover some more in-depth material on one of the more important aspects of writing plugins in Sublime Text, commands. Hello, fellow Sublime Text fanatics. Odette Nerd here. Welcome back to Plugin 101, the video series teaching you how to become a package and plugin author in Sublime Text. The topic of today's lesson is commands. So this is something we talked about in the terminology lesson last time around. And commands allow you to take some sort of action inside of Sublime Text. And as a result, it's one of the more common things to do when you're writing a plugin. If you're writing a plugin of any particular length, chances are good you're probably going to have to touch at one or more commands. But what exactly are commands? Well, very simply stated, command is something that allows you to take an action in response to something. Now, actions like this can be initiated by you as the user by pressing a key that you've bound to a command or choosing a menu item or a command palette entry. But plugins can also execute commands via plugin code as well. So regardless of what it is you're doing inside of your plugin, you can be executing commands. And sometimes that's vital for reasons we'll see in just a moment. But that gives you a whole extra facility to writing a plugin in Sublime Text, because if there's already a command that does something that you want to do or a part of something that you'd like to do, you don't have to re-implement everything from scratch. You can take commands written by you, by other plugin authors, by the authors of Sublime as well, with the commands that come pre-installed inside of it when you install it, and compose them together like Lego building bricks to come up with a whole new thing that does a combination of actions that weren't otherwise possible. As a matter of fact, there are actual whole packages out there that are dedicated to the idea of composing commands together like this. The chain of commands and the multi-command packages, both of which we've covered on previous videos in the channel, are purpose-built to actually be able to execute other commands via the plugin command that those package authors created in order to create more complex actions. Commands in our plugins are defined by creating classes. Now, plugins are just standard Python files, and we can put any valid Python code we want inside of the plugin file. So, how does Sublime know when we intended one class to be a command and another to be a support class needed by the command? And the answer to that lies in the base class of the class that you create. Now, when Sublime successfully finishes loading a plugin file, it looks at all of the symbols that that plugin defines to find all of the ones that are classes. And from the things that are classes, it examines the base classes of each class that's found to see, are any of them subclasses of a command class? And if it is, then that class is deemed to be a command. It's set aside in a special list and is used to create the command objects that we'll be talking about in just a moment. Now, as we touched on briefly in the terminology lesson, and we can also see in the window right now, there are three classes that we can use to create commands: the TextCommand class, the WindowCommand class, and the ApplicationCommand class. And there are differences between those, very subtle differences, and why you choose one over the other. We're going to be talking about in just a moment. So by creating a subclass of one of these three classes, you're telling Sublime this class represents a command. Now, the other thing to mention here, besides the fact that these three commands are mostly the same and have very slight differences, is that the name of the command created is inferred from the name of the class used to define it. So what happens is a very specific set of three rules. Rule 1, take the name of the class and lowercase the very first letter. So for example, example1 command becomes example1 command with a lowercase e. Rule 2, any uppercase letters that exist in the name are replaced with an underscore and a lowercase version of that particular letter. So in this particular example, example1 command becomes example_1_ command, all lowercase. The third rule is that if the resulting name ends in underscore command, throw that part away. So the class name example1 command creates a command named example1. And similarly for example2 command and example3 command, we can extrapolate what the name on those would be. Now, it's a convention, not a requirement, that the classes you create have a suffix of command on the end of them, such as these ones do here. And again, that's just a convention. It's nothing that's strictly needed. If you don't put command on the end of the class, that it will still work because it's the subclass the base class that we are subclassing that tells Sublime that this is a command. And if the underscore command isn't on the end of the converted name, it doesn't have to throw it away. But it can be a good habit to get into to do that, because if you're navigating around, say, with go to anything inside of your package, it's easy to see what classes represent commands versus just standard classes you have in there for support purposes. And the last thing to note is that all commands that are defined by all plugins are all part of one giant list of commands inside of Sublime. There's no such thing as a namespace of the commands that came from this plugin versus that plugin. So it can be a good idea to namespace your commands by adding something extra to their name to let them know that it's part of your particular package. Now, if you're creating a command for your own personal use and putting in your user package, that part generally doesn't apply. Now, there are three different types of commands that we can create, and these are all slightly different, but they're also the same as well. And that can be confusing, so let me explain. First of all, there's a lot about commands, despite the different types of them, that is identical regardless of the type of command that it is. They are all defined by classes, for example. The name of the command comes from the name of the class that's used to define it. All of the command classes are actually subclasses of an internal command class named Sublime Plugin.command, which provides the list of methods that commands are expected to have and what the default values for those methods are. Those methods are the way that Sublime interacts with the command, how it tells it to execute itself, how it asks it if it should be disabled right now, things of that nature. So in that regard, commands are the same, but they are a little bit different in some of their functionalities as well. Some in a more functional way and others in more of a convenience way, if you will. Now, this is going to refer back to the terminology we learned in the previous lesson. So if any of this doesn't make any sense, then you may need to go back and watch that lesson again, and then this will be a little bit clearer. Let's talk first about the TextCommand class. There are two main claims to fame when it comes to the TextCommand class. The first is that it's the only way to get an edit object. And as we learned in that terminology lesson, any and all edits to any buffer of any sort inside of Sublime Text need an edit object, because all of the API methods that you can use to modify a buffer, to insert text, to delete text, to alter existing text, all require an edit object. Sublime uses that to group all of the changes made by a sequence of commands that were done all as part of one operation, so that it knows how to undo it and put it back without having to re-execute those commands. The only way to get an edit object is via a text command, because when the run method in a text command is invoked, it will always be given a valid edit object as its first argument. So at any time in your Sublime career, if you've ever seen anything ever modify a buffer, it was using a text command. Anything you want to do to modify a buffer thus has to be a text command somewhere down the line. Although keep in mind that Sublime does have a lot of internal commands that are text commands, like insert and append and such. So for some operations, you don't technically need to create a text command, but if you want to do anything custom and specific, then you definitely do. The second claim to fame is that there's one instance of the TextCommand class created for every view, which, for example, in this case, there's 3 tabs open in this, which means there are 3 views open here, which means there are at least 3 instances of example1 command created right now. And of course, as we learned in the other lesson, there's more of those because the input widgets in the command palette and the view on the console and such are also views, but at least 3. There's multiples of these. The view that it was created for is in its self.view member or property, if you're more familiar familiar with that term. And that means that when a text command is invoked, it inherently knows in what view it was invoked for. So if you wanted to insert text at the press of a key, you know exactly what file without having to get at that by asking Sublime what the active view is right now. The second command we can create is the window command, and its claim to fame is that there's one instance of it created for every window in Sublime Text. Right now there's one window open, so there's one instance of example2 command, and much like a text command knows what view it's inside of via its self.view property, a window command knows what window it's being executed inside of via its self.window property. So you would use a window command when you're doing something specific to a window, such as wanting to open a file, create a new file in a current window, work with a project that's open inside of a window, things of that nature. And the last type of command here is the application command, whose main claim to fame is that there's only ever one instance of it created ever, regardless of how many files you have open or how many windows there are available. There's only ever one instance of this class ever created. And you would use something like this generally for an operation that's not specific to a file and not specific to a window, but specific to the application as a whole. For example, changing the font size via the mouse wheel or the key bindings, those commands are implemented as application commands because they're modifying global settings, for example, things of that nature. Now that we know a little bit more about the classes that can be used to define commands, let's talk about the methods in those classes and how Sublime uses them to interact with our command. To demonstrate this, I have two things. I have this plugin, which defines a single command named example, and I have this Sublime menu file with a single entry in it that will execute that particular example command with two arguments, a position of 10 and a text of hello world. There's also a caption here that specifies what this command looks like in the menu. Now I have swapped the context menu in this particular file to be that menu, so we just see this happening right here. And how you do something like this is going to be the topic of a future video on the channel and in this lesson series. So if you wanted to know how to do that and you haven't already subscribed, now might be the time to hit the button down there. And that's just going to make it a little bit easier to demonstrate this. Before we get started, I should also point out a couple of things. First, a lot of the methods in this class have an argument that says event equals none on the end. That's to facilitate a later part of the demonstration. I didn't want to have a separate file for that. So until we get to want event down there on line 25 and what it does, you can completely ignore that that is even there. And secondly, I have a terrible habit of saying command when I mean to say method when I'm talking about these things. So if I flip up there, I'm talking about methods and not about commands in particular. It's a particularly unfortunate brain tick to have when you're talking about methods in commands. The first method that we're going to talk about in this command is the run method. This is the one that Sublime will execute whenever this command is executed, be it by a key binding press, a menu item, a command palette, a macro, another plugin, whatever the case, this run method will be executed. Now, because this is a text command, the first argument is and always will be an edit object. And as we said, that will only appear in the text command. It won't appear for window commands and application commands. Apart from that, we can put any arguments to this run method as we want and need for our command to execute. Here we need text to insert and a position to insert it into, so that's why we've chosen those two particular arguments. By specifying these as arguments to the run method, that means that whenever you do something like create a menu entry or a key binding or things of that nature, you have to provide the args key that specifies the value for those particular arguments, here position 10 and text hello world. Because these two arguments, text and pos, don't have a default value, they are absolutely required. If you don't provide them when you execute the command, your command will fail and generate an error in the command palette, with one specific exception that we're going to discuss in just a few minutes. But by and large, that's the case. If you specify arguments here, you have to provide them when you're executing your command. And note also that when you're providing these arguments, they can only be the core types in Python. For example, integers, booleans, lists, and objects. There are some technical reasons having to do with how the plugin host and the core of Sublime communicate behind the scenes. The easiest way to remember why this is absolutely required is that you have to be able to express your command in a JSON file with this args dictionary, and JSON only supports strings and integers and lists and objects. So it's not possible to put, say, a custom class of your own devising in there. You'd have to do that in a different way. When you run the command, Sublime will invoke the run method with all of the arguments that you provided. So if I was to choose this item from the menu, up there on line 1, it inserts the text "Hello World" starting at point 10 in the file, just like so. And that's how that working. These bits here we're going to see in just a few minutes when we get on down to that part of the demonstration. Now, you may have noticed that sometimes commands can be enabled or disabled. For example, they could be grayed out in the menu or not work when you press the key, even if that key is bound. That is due to the fact that commands have this isEnabled method they support. The default for this is to return true, as we see here. So by default, if you don't provide this particular method, your command will just always be enabled. Now, isEnabled takes as arguments the same arguments that run takes and accepts for being able to execute the command, with the exception of the edit argument in a text command, because those are only in the run method of the text command. They don't appear anywhere else. The purpose of isEnabled is to tell Sublime whether your command should be enabled or not. Sublime will provide to you the same arguments that it would have provided if the command was executed, which allows you to determine if your command should be enabled or not based on what it might do. For example, we might have the command disable itself if the position was less than 10, for example. Now, the default here is to return true, which enables the command. We could specify false here, for example, to say that this is not enabled. Now, what we're going to see is when I open the menu, this command is now disabled. I cannot select it and I can't pick it, and it will not execute. And that's because this command is disabled. There are a few ways that this can go. If this command is in a menu, it will appear grayed out and be unselectable. If it's bound to a key, pressing that key won't do anything. If the command has been added to the command palette, it won't display there because the command palette only displays commands that can be executed right now, and disabled commands can't be executed. I'm going to swap that back to enable this command for the next demonstration, which is the isVisible method, which tells Sublime whether or not your command should be visible or not. And again, as we can see here, the default is to be true so that all commands are visible. Now, it's important to note being visible and being enabled are not mutually exclusive. It's possible for a command to be invisible but still enabled. That means you can't see it, but you can still execute it. What do we mean by being visible? Well, if a command is visible, then if it's been added to the menu, you'll see it in the menu. And if it's been added to the command palette, you'll see it in the command palette. And if we were to set this to false, for example, if I open the menu, we don't actually see the menu opening. And that's because this command is invisible. That menu has only this one command in it, so there's nothing to display, no menu appears. In this particular example, if you did this under Linux, you would see an empty menu that just has no items in it. This is a little bit of a platform-specific action that happens here. And of course, if the menu had multiple commands in it, then just this one command would be missing. And just like above, much in the same way that isEnabled would be called to tell you with the arguments so that you could determine if you're enabled in a specific situation, isVisible tells you if you would be visible or not in a specific situation. So we could hide this from the menu if the text contained the word hello, for example. Lastly, for purposes of working with a menu, you can have isChecked in here as well. And isChecked is something that you can use to determine if your menu item has a check mark next to it. And as we can see here, the default for this is false. So by default, the menu item would not have a check next to it. Now, you may have seen examples of this before. For example, the tools save all on build has a check mark next to it when it's turned on and doesn't have a check mark next to it when it's not. Word wrap works similarly. And of course, the way you see the check depends on the operating system that you're used. That is controlled by two things. This is checked method and this item over here in the menu where it says checkbox true, which I'm going to turn on right now. In order for this to work, checkbox true has to be in the menu entry for this particular thing. And again, we're going to go over that in a future lesson. So by default, the value for this is false. So now that I've turned that on in the menu, if I hit this, we can see there's no check mark next to this. But if I was to set this to true and do it, now there is a check mark next to it. And as I said, much like is enabled and is visible, the arguments that would have been provided to run are given to the isChecked method, so you can determine if you would be checked or not based on the arguments that you were given. The last thing to talk about here, I said lastly for isChecked, but actually lastly for description, having to do with menu items specifically, is a way to set the caption for menu items. Now, isChecked only works in menus because the command palette doesn't support checkboxes. Description, although you might think it might work in the command palette, only works in menus for a very specific reason. But let's talk about what it actually does first. So first of all, we'll note that over here in the python.sublime menu file, there's this item here that says caption plugin 101 example. And that's why when I open the menu, it says plugin 101 example. That's how you set that particular text. Now, you may have noticed that some menu items, for example, if we went up to the view menu and go into the sidebar options, change what their menu text looks like depending on what this current situation is. For example, this says hide sidebar because the sidebar is turned on, although invisible right now because there's no folders open. And show open files is there because show open files is turned off. But if you were to pick that option, it would change its text to hide open files. That is done by way of this. Now, in order for this to work, the menu item can't have a specific static caption on it. So we need to cancel that out like so. Now, if we came over here, the default for the description method, if you don't provide one in your class, is to return an empty string. The result of that is when you open the menu, you see a title case version of the command name in the menu because it's got to display something. So here, because the name of the command is example, it pops up as example here with an uppercase character there. But we could swap that to be this. Now, much like all these other methods, the description method gets the same arguments that would have been provided to run, so that you can change the description of your command in the menu based on what it would do. So now it's going to set its caption to tell you what text the argument that the command gets would be inserting. And now that I have saved that, when I open the menu, it says insert hello world because that's what the menu is providing there. Now, this does only work in the menu. It doesn't work in the command palette. And that's because when you go to the command palette, you expect to be able to say something like arithmetic and find the actual arithmetic command. If it was possible for commands to swap what they say in the command palette based on their situation, it would be harder to dial in and figure out what you should actually be searching for in that thing. I'm going to leave that one the way it is for the time being. Now, we're going to talk here next about want event. Now, this particular method is the reason why all of the methods that we've seen up to this point have this argument on the end that says event equals none. Normally, those wouldn't be there. They'd only be there if you were using want event in the way we're about to describe. But like I said, I didn't want to have multiple example files for this. Normally, when you execute a command, Sublime will just invoke the run method, giving it the arguments that were specified in the key binding or the menu or what have you. Sometimes you want more context information. For example, when you're using a context menu, you might want to do something based on where the user clicked their mouse, for example. But if I do that, even though I clicked there, I execute the command, it's inserting it up at the top of the buffer because that's what the arguments are telling it. But sometimes you want that to work. And in order to get that to happen, we use this want event method. Now, here's what happens here. You specify that you want to return true from want event. Sublime invokes this to ask your command, do you want me to pass an event argument to your methods? The default is false, which means it's not provided. I've just set it to true, which means that in cases where the mouse was used or the context menu was opened, when the run command or run method, I did it, is executed or is enabled or is visible or is checked or description, provide to it the actual event object that specifies where the cursor was in the window. And this is perhaps best shown with the example code here, because if we look at lines 7 and 8, if an event object is provided, it uses an API method to use the event's X and Y positions to figure out a point inside of the file. So because want event now returns true, Sublime asks our command, do you want the event argument? We say yes. When it runs the command, it will provide an event that allows that code to execute. And the result is when I pick it here, it inserts right where the menu was open, where the cursor location was at. And similarly, if I was to right click and pick the menu here, note that the cursor is still down on line 26. When I pick this item, it inserts where the menu was opened. And this is what these event arguments is doing here. Now, this only works for when the context menu is open. This wouldn't work from the command palette, for example, or from a key binding, but it will work in this particular case, which allows it to determine what position in the buffer it is. So in cases where your command is executed and that's not available, no event argument would be passed. That's why all of these say event equals none here, because if want event is false, or if want event is true but it can't display it, then Sublime won't pass an event argument to run. But without a default, run will complain that you didn't provide its particular argument. Speaking of that, are these last two items here, which we're going to just quickly gloss over because they're the topic of next week's lesson, and they have to do with using input handlers inside of your command. And examples of input handlers, again, are the arithmetic command, like so, where we can do random arithmetic and do other manipulations. There's a video on the channel if you're interested in that particular command and what it can do. Now, we said at the beginning that the run method will generate an error if you don't provide it all of the arguments that it expects. But that's kind of a half-truth, because if your command implements this input method in a way that we're going to talk about in the next lesson, and your command is in the command palette, then it's possible to actually have it prompt you for the arguments to use. But that's going to be the topic of next week's lesson, so we're not going to cover that here. We learned a fair bit of information in today's lesson, so to recap, one of the things we can do inside of a plugin is create our own actions by way of commands. Commands are created by creating classes in our plugin with very specific base classes that signal that they represent commands, and the name of the eventual command is inferred from the name of the class used to create it. There are three different types of commands we can create: text commands that are associated with views and are the only way to make modifications to text areas, window commands that are associated with windows, and application commands, which are just associated with the application as a whole. And with the exception of text commands being required to make modifications to text editing areas throughout Sublime, you can more or less use any command to do anything you like, although some of them make things easier than others. Now, one of the things I'd like to do in this lesson series is more deep dives into how you might actually apply this information now that we have a solid base on which to draw. So do you have any examples for commands and other plugins that you'd like to see talked about in this course? Let me know down in the comments section below. However, the next lesson after this one is planned to be the input handler, which will show us how we can create the ability to have Sublime prompt us for what our command arguments should be in the command palette if they weren't provided. And if you'd like to get notified when that happens and you haven't already done so, you might want to use those buttons down below to thumb, subscribe, and share as you deem appropriate. But until the next lesson, this is ODAT Nerd asking you to please have a sublime day.